Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Jaime Monllor and I am the International Outreach Officer at the David M. Rubenstein Institute for Holocaust Documentation of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. It is an honor for us to be here today to present the webinar, Preserving Holocaust History Through Oral Histories and Films, in partnership with Generations of the Shoah International, World Federation of Jewish Holocaust Survivors and Descendants, Descendants of Holocaust Survivors, and LEAS, the Latin American Network for the Teaching of the Holocaust, la Red Latinoamericana para la Enseñanza de la Shoah. Today's webinar is the second part of a two-part series. Last week, we presented Preserving Holocaust History Through Artifacts and Research. Before we continue, a few housekeeping notes. We ask for your forgiveness if there are technical difficulties. This is a live program and anything can happen. This program is being recorded and it will be shared with our partners and on our YouTube channel for future viewing. The questions and chat functions are disabled. Because this is a webinar format program and due to the amount of people attending, we will not be taking questions. However, everyone will get a follow-up email after the program where you can ask any questions and make virtual appointments with our curators. This gathering is being offered in closed captioning, and if you would like to utilize that feature, please press the CC closed captioning button towards the bottom right of your screen. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is in a race against time to rescue the evidence of the Holocaust from Jewish and non-Jewish victims, survivors, eyewitnesses, as well as from members of their families, second and third generations. The museum's David M. Rubenstein National Institute for Holocaust Documentation is responsible for building, preserving, and making accessible America's collection of records on the Holocaust, an unparalleled repository documenting the fate of victims, survivors, rescuers, liberators, and others. The collection of records also documents the atrocities perpetrated by the Nazis and their collaborators. We collect artifacts, documents, photographs, films, music, and oral testimonies so that researchers can study the events of the Holocaust and understand the relevance of this history in our own time. We need to continue rescuing these materials before it is too late and the eyewitness generations and their families are no longer with us. We are committed to document the atrocities implemented by the Nazis and their collaborators by acquiring, preserving, and making this evidence accessible to everyone. This evidence also supports the museum's wide-ranging efforts in the areas of research, exhibitions, publications, education, and commemoration, and should be preserved for future generations to come. Together, we will continue building the collection of records on the Holocaust, making it accessible anytime, anywhere, to ensure we can teach this history with authenticity and relevance to every new generation. And now, I would like to introduce you to Esther Finder, founder and president of Generations of the Shoah, Nevada, president of the Holocaust Survivors Group of Southern Nevada, and former president of the Generation After in the Washington, D.C. area. Esther was appointed by the governor of Nevada to the Advisory Council of Education relating to the Holocaust, and she is on the Coordinating Council of Generations of the Shoah International, the Executive Committee of the World Federation of Jewish Child Survivors of the Holocaust and Descendants, the Executive Committee of the Holocaust Survivors Foundation, USA, and one of the founders of the new Holocaust Intergenerational Global Coalition. Esther is a longtime friend of the museum and has been involved with our oral history program, conducting interviews since the early days of the museum, and still conducts Holocaust survivors' testimony for the USC Shoah Foundation. She has conducted over 250 interviews for both institutions. We do appreciate Esther's commitment and thank her for helping us to make this webinar possible. Esther, I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you. I asked for help on behalf of my brothers and sisters who are interested in learning more about our families and what befell them during World War II. This series is designed to assist the intergenerational and international Holocaust survivor community and others learn about resources available to us as we try to uncover more about our own history. In the first part of this webinar series, we saw how the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is collecting and preserving photos, documents, and artifacts from that horrible period. The items survivors and their families donate can help other families gain insight into what happened to loved ones who did not survive. It can also help us fill in gaps in our knowledge. Survivors themselves did not always know what was happening around them during the war years. Descendants might have been hesitant to ask their survivor questions for fear of re-traumatizing their parents or grandparents. To be sure, there are always countless questions that come to mind when we no longer have our precious survivors with us. Every document, every photo, every artifact, every film is a link for us to a past world that is no more. Today, we will learn about the power of film and oral history and how these can also link us to what was. My mother died before we had the technology to record oral histories that we have now. Though I cannot listen to her voice, I can hear eyewitnesses talk about the Lodz Ghetto, Birkenau, Bergen-Belsen, and the other places she endured. Those testimonies give us insights into my mother's life that are precious to my family. Our heartfelt thanks to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for this series. They are our partners in preserving and protecting this history.
And now I would like to introduce today's speakers, who are two outstanding Rubenstein Institute colleagues. First, you will hear from James Gilmore, the museum's oral history curator. James has helped to shape the foundational collection of oral testimonies for the past 20 years. He is responsible for the acquisition of oral testimonies and related artifacts from other Holocaust archives and individual donors, which has helped to build the museum's collection of records on the Holocaust. Following James, you will hear from Leslie Swift, the museum's special advisor on time-based media. Leslie has worked at the museum for 25 years, first in the photo archives and then in the Steven Spielberg Film and Video Archive, which houses the museum's extensive collection of archival film from the Holocaust era. For 8 years, from 2014 to 2022, she was chief of the Film, Oral History, and Recorded Sound Department of the museum. James?
For the past 20 years, I've had the privilege of helping shape the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Jeff and Toby Herr Oral History Archive alongside my colleagues. I'm excited to speak to you all today about the museum's work to acquire and produce what has become one of the largest, most diverse, and most publicly accessible collections of Holocaust testimonies in the world. As a primary source archive, the museum's oral history collection draws from firsthand eyewitness accounts to present Holocaust history with authenticity and enduring relevance for each new generation. In this presentation, I will provide an overview of the ongoing development of the Oral History Archive, as well as its role in the museum's wide-ranging efforts to support Holocaust research, exhibition, education, and memorialization. For over 3 decades, the museum's oral history program has been building a diverse collection of Holocaust testimonies, featuring the experiences of Jewish survivors, political prisoners, Romani people, Jehovah's Witnesses, members of the LGBTQ+ community, individuals who were persecuted under Nazi racial hygiene policy, such as the deaf or hard of hearing, and other groups who were targeted by the Nazis and their collaborators. The collection also includes interviews with liberators, rescuers, resistance fighters, relief workers, journalists, and post-war prosecutors. For instance, we have several interviews with the late great Nuremberg trial prosecutor, Benjamin Ferencz, who is pictured in the center frame. Furthermore, the collection includes interviews with other types of witnesses, that is, with people who are still living in Europe in some of the very towns and villages in which they watched their Jewish neighbors face harassment, deportation, and murder under Nazi occupation. We also have a small number of interviews with collaborators and perpetrators, though as I will discuss later, these categories such as witness and collaborator aren't always so conceptually bounded or straightforward. 3 key programs have contributed to the building of the museum's oral history archive. 1, museum productions in North America, focused mostly on survivors, but also includes liberators and other types of eyewitnesses. 2, museum productions with survivors and witnesses throughout Europe and into Central Asia. And 3, the acquisition of existing collections held in private hands or other archival repositories across the globe. I will speak about each of these programs, starting with domestic production. Since 1989, the museum has been producing interviews with survivors and witnesses in North America as part of its mission to document and preserve primary source material that will allow future generations of researchers to learn in intimate detail from a broad range of individuals who experienced or witnessed the genocidal policies and crimes of the Nazis and their collaborators. Our interviews with survivors typically focus on their entire life story, from their earliest childhood memories through their wartime and post-war experiences to their present-day lives. And those testimonies often include reflections on whatever is happening at the moment, domestically or geopolitically. Until recently, these interviews typically took place in an interviewee's home, requiring several hours of setup and recording with a video crew and an interviewer. The COVID-19 pandemic prompted the museum to quickly change its approach, switching from in-person production to remote interviewing through video conferencing platforms. And here are some examples of Zoom recorded testimonies conducted by my colleague Ina Nevezelskis, pictured in the middle. In contrast to our expectation that production capacity would diminish with lockdowns and stay-at-home orders, we were pleased to discover that through remote interviewing, we could reach more survivors than ever before. The remote interview process also made it possible to delve deeper into survivor stories by following up with interviewees at their convenience, and it led to some longer and more detailed testimonies. Our successful pivot to remote interviewing was largely due to the fact that many of our interviewees already had experience with using video chat platforms to connect with loved ones since the early days of the pandemic. While some in-person interviewing in the United States will return in the near future, we will continue with this remote model moving forward, since our main US-based interviewer no longer has to be limited by geography or travel. While the majority of our interviews in the United States have been conducted in English, it may be of interest to note that this past April, we produced our very first interview in American Sign Language. We partnered with the National Technical Institute for the Deaf to interview a 95-year-old woman in New York named Ruth Stern, pictured here. In her interview, Mrs. Stern discusses her experiences as a deaf person in Nazi Germany and her difficulty in obtaining a visa to the United States, a common theme that runs through a number of deaf survivor testimonies. Our interview with Mrs. Stern grew out of a project to address a significant gap in our collection in regard to the deaf Holocaust experience. In 2017, we began reaching out to deaf survivors and their descendants to document their experiences through artifacts, documents, and testimonies. To prepare for our interview with Mrs. Stern, we consulted with deaf scholars to learn the best way to interview a deaf person, which includes such considerations as how to light the dominant signing hand and how to frame the interviewee so that both of their hands are visible on screen. The National Technical Institute for the Deaf graciously handled the filming and the post-production work to provide voiceover so that both hearing and deaf audiences can access the interview online. During the past decade, we've also developed other initiatives to address similar gaps in our collection. For example, until about a decade ago, we had very few testimonies from the Orthodox Jewish community until we partnered with an organization in New York to record those stories. We continue, as Jaime said in his introduction, to race against time to record as many testimonies as possible while the eyewitness generation is still with us. Turning to Europe, in the late 1990s, we expanded our scope to include other types of eyewitnesses whose testimonies add valuable context and nuance to survivor stories. To date, we've produced interviews in more than 30 countries throughout Europe and into Central Asia with individuals who are not direct victims of Nazi persecution, but might instead be grouped under the umbrella term of witness. This includes onlookers or so-called bystanders, collaborators, and in a few cases, perpetrators. Though, as I mentioned earlier, terms such as bystander, witness, and collaborator aren't always mutually exclusive, and we don't use those specific descriptors for individual interviews in our catalog records. Many European witnesses are still living in the very towns and villages from which their Jewish neighbors were deported or murdered nearby. And they've retained vivid memories of what they saw or participated in. Their involvement can often be complex and sometimes contradictory. For example, pictured here, we produced an interview with a woman in Lithuania who discusses how sad she was to see her Jewish neighbors being rounded up and murdered. But she also talks about looting a pair of shoes from a Jewish home and later discusses how she got a great deal on her gold tooth or a gold filling, the origin of which we can only assume. Last year, the museum produced 219 testimonies for the European Witness Initiative in 12 countries, including Ukraine, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Austria, Germany, Belgium, the UK, France, Spain, and Italy. A couple of important highlights include testimonies from local witnesses to death marches in Austria, and the memories from Kindertransport foster siblings, who are pictured here. Previously, both of these subjects were gaps in the oral history collection. The Kindertransport, for example, has been well documented and well understood from the perspective of Jewish child refugees, while very little testimony from the foster families had been recorded. Our interviews from last year with non-Jewish foster siblings revealed, among other things, the moral imperative that motivated foster families to open up their homes to Jewish refugees. We're still actively involved in looking for eyewitness testimony in Europe and elsewhere in the world where people's lives intersected with the Holocaust, such as in North Africa and throughout Latin America. In addition to producing interviews in the US and overseas, my colleagues and I have looked to repositories across the globe to acquire existing oral testimonies. Many oral history collections are still widely held in private hands or in small archives that lack the resources to preserve these materials in perpetuity. We've endeavored to build a collection of record on the Holocaust by acquiring and digitizing as much audiovisual testimony as possible from libraries, filmmakers, universities, remembrance organizations, individual donors, and smaller museums and archival repositories. Likewise, the museum has partnered with larger, well-established institutions to acquire copies of their oral history collections. These partnerships have been vital to building the collection of record and to making the stories of eyewitnesses accessible to audiences everywhere for many years to come. Some examples of content we recently acquired include interviews with survivors of Sobibor concentration camp, European refugees who fought as part of Allied forces, and members of the prosecutorial team who were present at the Nuremberg trials. We are now in the process of acquiring a large collection of interviews with survivors who lived through both Nazism and communism, and were still struggling with their daily lives in remote areas of Europe during the time period in which they were interviewed. We're also working with Brandeis University to acquire their oral history collection, which dates back to the early 1970s and has never been digitized nor listened to since then. The oral histories that we collect range in production quality and type, from studio recorded interviews by professional oral historians to testimonies recorded by students, or most often by family members of survivors. Some of these are pictured here. And we receive these interviews on a range of mediums and formats, from outmoded videotapes and audio cassettes to digital video recordings on smartphones or high-resolution cameras. The point is that regardless of whether they were recorded in a studio, a classroom, or from the family room couch, all of these interviews preserve stories that would otherwise be lost to time. It's also important to note that in addition to acquiring oral testimonies, we are actively collecting artifacts, documents, photographs, film, and music from the pre-war, wartime, and immediate post-war periods so that we can build, preserve, and make accessible one of the world's most comprehensive collections of materials and documentation on the Holocaust. These artifacts from across formats help shed light on lived experience, adding valuable context and richness to the stories that survivors tell. Turning now to how users can access this material, a key feature of our oral history archive is that most of the interviews in our collection are available to global audiences through our online catalog. The museum is committed to making its oral history collection as accessible as possible, because we know that oral testimonies provide researchers with the opportunity to gain a deeper and often more nuanced understanding of the Holocaust and its direct impact on individuals as human beings in the way that analysis of historical texts cannot. Therefore, most interviews can be viewed or listened to in full, and many are discoverable through keyword searches in our catalog. Moreover, we neither charge for copies nor the use of the material in films or exhibitions. But one of the most meaningful results of this accessibility is that at least once a month, someone writes us to say that they only just discovered that their late grandmother or grandfather gave an oral testimony, and they found it through our website. And it's often the case that this is the very first time they've heard their loved one's voice in many years. I would like to conclude this presentation on a more personal note. When I reflect on the significance of oral testimony, or more precisely, what it means to a survivor when they share their most intimate memories of trauma and loss, I think of Fanny Eisenberg. Fanny Eisenberg was born in 1916 in Łódź, Poland, and was already married and had a child by the time she was discovered in hiding and deported to Auschwitz. Despite being a museum volunteer for several years, she was well into her 90s before she finally agreed to share her story with others. In her 2011 video interview, she said that one of the reasons why she waited so long was that she was still living with the horrors that she experienced in Auschwitz, and she felt inferior to other people because of what she had suffered. At the conclusion of her interview, she said that by sharing her story with others, it felt like, in her words, like soothing medicine. And the reactions she received from listeners were, as she put it, like pats on the back to say, "You're okay." My hope is that for survivors who share their most difficult and guarded memories, telling their story on record is a transformative experience, similar to Fanny's, that in some way unburdens them from carrying the weight of trauma on their own. Moreover, I hope that survivors are aware that their testimonies are invaluable tools for teaching Holocaust history and for combating Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism, and that their testimonies are beyond precious to their family members. I know that a number of you attending this presentation are the children or descendants of survivors and may have donated testimony and artifacts to the museum or registered a loved one in our survivors registry. Or perhaps you're a member of a community remembrance organization, or you've been involved in teaching about the Holocaust or producing Holocaust scholarship. I'm grateful to be able to spend this time with all of you, fellow stewards of memory, who have helped us safeguard the truth and preserve these precious stories for generations to come. And now I'm happy to turn things over to my wonderful colleague, Leslie Swift, who will talk about the museum's oral history, the museum's collection of historical film. Thank you.
You, James. And thank you all for coming. My name is Leslie Swift, and I am the Special Advisor for Time-Based Media at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The Film and Video Archive consists of over 1,000 hours of historical film from the Holocaust period, and it serves as a resource for researchers from around the world for use in the documentation, illustration, study, analysis, and teaching of Holocaust history. While our holdings comprise a large number of professionally shot films showing such subjects as Nazi propaganda, persecution of victim groups, newsreels, and liberation footage, among many other subjects, this evening I will be talking to you about the museum's collection of personal amateur films. And just to reassure you, I will not be talking the whole time. I will also show you clips at a couple of points during the presentation. Our collection of amateur films, most of which were donated to us by Holocaust survivors and their families, provide a unique depiction of the circumstances and lived experiences of individuals. While the history of the Holocaust is often necessarily told at the level of nations, armies, and world leaders, part of what motivates us to collect and preserve amateur films is the belief that by doing so, we are documenting history as it was lived on the ground by individuals. Each person seen in home movies lived a unique history of their own. This is history as lived by the millions of individuals who were there and whose daily lives were disrupted, subsumed, and forever altered. Our collections include home movies of birthday parties, trips to the beach, and religious practice in the years before the war, as well as images of families who managed to leave Europe and their experiences as they built new lives in unfamiliar surroundings. The immediate post-war years are also important as those who survived returned to their homes, began life anew in displaced persons camps, searched for family members, or left Europe to reunite with relatives or rebuild their lives on other continents. I'm now going to play you a brief clip showing the types of home movies you will find in the museum's archive. Keep in mind that we have many hours of such footage from many countries, and these films are available to search in our online catalog, which I will get to in a little bit. So what do we do with the films we collect, either amateur films or footage copied from archives in the US and Europe? First, we must locate them. Obviously, we cannot rescue these films, which could be deteriorating rapidly if kept in suboptimal conditions without knowing where they are. We also ensure that they are properly preserved, which begins with digitization, but does not end there. Once collections items have been digitized, the digital files are added to our complex digital infrastructure. There is an entire division within the Rubenstein Institute that oversees the 90 million files that make up the museum's digital collections. Among other duties, they ensure that there is enough storage space for our digital collections and that individual files can be linked to their corresponding catalog records. They also conduct automatic checks for corrupted files and keep up with technological advances so they know when to migrate data to new file types or when a new file type might take up less space or improve performance. All of this and much more is required to keep our promise to our donors that we will maintain collections that are entrusted to us in perpetuity. Another part of this effort is storing original films in specialized archival containers and secure climate-controlled vaults. Now, after all of that information that I just threw at you, I'm going to give you another little break here and show a few minutes of relatively newly acquired footage. And I always find it amazing myself, and other people do too, that we are still discovering films even now. If you happen to have seen the recent film 3 Minutes, A Lengthening, this is another home movie shot by an American immigrant on a visit to his hometown. It was shot by Abe Hershkovitz, and that he returned to the US with this footage ensured that we now have a visual record of this small town and its residents, which we would not necessarily, we probably would not have, first of all, the footage wouldn't have been shot at all. And also it would not have been preserved if it were left to its own devices in Europe. This footage shows Kurt and Elise Lemley about to return to the US after a visit with family in Germany. Kurt and his brother Max founded Lemley Theaters, which is still in the Lemley family, with 8 theaters in and around the greater Los Angeles area. Kurt and Max's uncle was the founder of Universal Pictures, and his name was Carl Lemley. He rescued hundreds of Jews by guaranteeing financial support. And in fact, when the US government told him he could no longer do that, he got his friends to pledge financial support in order to keep rescuing people. Walter Rauscher shot this footage in several locations as he made the journey from Marseille to Manila with 13 other Jewish refugees in 1939. Walter met up with family members who had also secured visas to Manila, and much of the family left Manila for New York in 1940. And all of these clips are clips from, let's see, 4 different collections and 3 or 4 different collections, and all of them are edited. And what that means is there is a lot more in each of these collections online to view. And there's also just a lot more of these types of films and the stories of the individuals. To make the collection accessible, we document each film and, as I mentioned at the beginning, make them available to Holocaust history researchers worldwide via collection search, which is pictured here. It's the same site that James showed you. Many of you are probably familiar with this search, but I'm going to show you a couple of features that you might not know about so that any of you who may need archive footage for educational or personal projects know where to come. So this is the landing page of Collection Search. And if you scroll down a bit, you'll see a number of filters that can be applied to your search. You can choose to retrieve all of the records we have on one of these listed camps, for example, or limit the type of material you would like to see. So you can you can see here on the side how many records will be returned for each choice that you enter into the catalog. But let's say you wanted to see what we had related to a particular city or town. I'm going to type in Nijelsk, which I happen to know is in Poland. It's the subject of 3 Minutes a Lengthening, the film I mentioned earlier that some of you have seen probably. So if you do a search like this, you'll probably have to be more specific if you're looking for footage from Berlin or Warsaw, because the number of results would be so large. But Nijelsk returns 61 results. And on the left, you can see that you can filter the results in various ways. And then if you want to know more about a certain record, click on it. And here you can watch the footage and then read as much as we know about this film. Over here on the right, you have the option to order a copy, a file of the footage. You have to walk through a process to obtain a free account first, but it's pretty straightforward. And depending on what your interest is in the film, I also recommend that you scroll all the way down to these fields here, about this film, keywords and subjects, etc. You can find more information in these menus about the camera person, as well as copyright, format, and other details. And if you scroll down even further at the bottom of the page here, you can see and click on other items in the collection. So I'm going to end my presentation by talking about a recent initiative we've undertaken. We are, of course, interested in any films that depict Holocaust history. However, in our work, we strive toward wider representation of that history by focusing on particular geographic areas or types of experiences that we know to be lacking in our collections. To that end, we are partnering with the Fundación Ivo, the Buenos Aires Holocaust Museum, the Jewish Archives of Chile, and the Jewish Documentation and Research Center of Mexico, focusing on the experiences of Jewish communities in Latin America as they were affected by the Holocaust. Excuse me. Subject areas might include movies shot in Europe either before, during, or immediately after the war, the journey from Europe or arrival in Latin America, activities and general life experiences related to establishing new lives, and interactions or efforts to help new immigrants that were organized by the Jewish or non-Jewish communities already living in Latin America. This, of course, is only a general list, and many subjects of interest might fall outside this description. As an example, I'm going to end by showing you one last clip. The film I'm going to show is donated to us by the nephew of David Glick. Glick was an attorney from Pittsburgh who worked as an unofficial representative of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee in Germany, at great risk to his own safety, from 1936 to 1938. In 1939, he traveled to a number of Latin American countries to survey the needs of the Austrian and German Jews who had settled there. So here's the beginning. The people are often surprised that there's color film from this period. Kodak actually began selling amateur gauge color film in 1936. And these first several scenes are in Trinidad. Here along the street here in a second, you're going to see at least one sign indicating a Jewish shop. And there you can see here the Shanghai Bazaar. I believe one of these people is David Glick. So the footage also contains some more traditional tourist views and activities, going to the waterfall. And now we're in Venezuela. These steamer trunks belong to Austrian and German Jewish refugees who arrived there on the SS Königstein. And you'll see a communal kitchen there set up to receive these refugees. As you can see here, you're going to see the side of a truck in a second. The Red Cross of Venezuela is on hand to greet these arriving refugees. Here you can see the Red Cross there. Now we are in Ecuador. These are German Jewish emigres, probably already established in South America for many years. And perhaps David Glick is talking to them about providing funds to incoming immigrants. On his trip, Glick did meet with those who had already made a life in Latin America and could help fund the joint's rescue efforts. We're still in Ecuador here. I think, let's see. So this film, just out of, for your interest, is the color is so beautiful, not because we did anything really to help it. We work with a really great lab in Rockville, Maryland, but it's Kodachrome, and Kodachrome often really holds its color very well. You saw some Kodachrome in the first clip I showed as well. So here is Moritz Hochschild, the man with the cigar, and he was very involved in he was a Bolivian, worked in the Bolivian mining industry, and he was very involved in helping refugees. So thank you very much, and I really hope you enjoyed the presentation. If anyone has any historical film that they'd be interested in donating or loaning to the museum, Esther has our contact information, and now I will turn it back over to Jaime.
Thank you, Leslie. Unfortunately, the program has to end. I would like to acknowledge and thank my colleagues, Leslie Swift and James Gilmore, for their wonderful, outstanding, and thought-provoking presentations. Also, I would like to thank the museum's behind-the-scenes team, our special events colleagues, who helped us to produce this program. And our partners, Esther Finder, Generation of the Shoah International, the World Federation of Jewish Holocaust survivors and descendants, descendants of the Holocaust survivors, and LEAS, the Latin America Network for Teaching of the Holocaust, la Red Latinoamericana para la Enseñanza de la Shoah. And last but not least, we want to thank you, the audience, for participating. As a reminder, everyone will receive a follow-up email by the end of this week with a link to set a virtual appointment with our curator to explore the donation of artifacts, films, and contributing an oral history to the museum. We encourage you to reach out to us. Again, thank you, be well, and stay safe.